So we've had opportunities now to discuss some of the early cultures of the ancient Mediterranean, including the ancient Near East, including the Sumerians, the Akkadians, Babylonians, etc. We've also had an opportunity to investigate and discuss the ancient Egyptians. So our next journey here really is going to take us into a realm that is more familiar, I think, for many of us. We're going to be talking here about the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, two cultures that we're probably quite a bit more familiar with in terms of art and history and culture, as these really do tend to form kind of the backbone of the Western canon of art. There's another group that we're going to be discussing here as well, and these are the ancient Etruscans. And the Etruscans are also really quite central to our course of study, although not really quite as well known as the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. So, as with really any of these cultural groups and periods in art history that we look at and discuss, context is obviously really important to our course of study, and this is quite central when we're talking about the Greeks. It's important that we have a solid understanding of context, as this plays an important role in our ability to understand Greek art and architecture. So a couple kind of key concepts that we're going to touch on here when it comes to Greek context. First, a little bit about geography. When we're talking about the geography of ancient Greece, we see that there's really a series of Greek city-states, including places like Athens and Sparta that we're familiar with, but they tend to be somewhat geographically isolated. And so this means that these city-states are separated from each other in terms of politics, in terms of, we do see, of course, wars and battles and things taking place between these states on occasion, but for the most part, they're able to kind of develop their own sense of identity. And we see this manifest itself in terms of the philosophy of the ancient Greeks. We see this concept of self-reliance, the emphasis on the individual, which will also, of course, manifest itself in something called humanism that we'll talk about here in a moment. But we do see a lot of shared aspects as well. We see shared religion, shared language, but of course we see very different concepts about political identity. Now, in terms of religion, the Greeks were polytheistic. They worshipped a pantheon of gods. Much like the ancient, Near East peoples that we've talked about, such as the Sumerians and others, it was quite common for a given city-state to have a patron god or goddess. The most central of these, of course, really will be when we're talking about Athens and, of course, Athena Parthenos. And we'll be investigating this in much greater detail, particularly when we talk about the Parthenon and some of the other structures of the Acropolis in Athens. But the Greeks had an interesting way of viewing their gods, quite different from what we'd expect to see if we were talking about the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, and even in Egypt, the gods are these distant and very strange and almost inhuman creatures, often with composite animal-like features. But the ancient Greeks didn't see their gods this way. They really saw them as people, but immortal people. But they had the same kinds of flaws as everyday people. They were jealous. They suffered fits of anger. They cheated on each other. They were petty. And so we see this really kind of unusual concept. It's often said that the Greeks made their heroes, like Achilles and these other people, into gods, and their gods really into people. And it's really kind of interesting how we see this concept. So these Greek gods are treated really like people, but with human ambitions and human passions, even though they're immortal. But one of the interesting results of this is that the Greeks believed that the human figure, the body, was really a vessel through which they could achieve this state of perfection, this idea of perfecting the human figure, and not just physically, really, but also mentally. The idea of achieving this sense of greatness within oneself, being physical perfection, mental ability, was really a possible way for the Greeks to achieve a state of semi-godhood, semi-divinity. And so we see this really as an important concept. We see it played out in terms of the rendering of the human figure. This kind of explains the importance of some of the activities like the Olympics that we would see, which originate with the Greeks. And we'll see this as kind of an ongoing, underscoring theme, is this idea of the emphasis on the human figure. So another concept that we'll talk about here We're looking at ancient Greeks, and some of the context involved here is humanism. So humanism is this concept, it's this idea about really trying to understand what it is to be human, and the relationship between the human and the world around them. And it really focuses on the worth of the individual. It's a very introspective concept. And this ties in, it's really a philosophy of education, a philosophy of self-worth that we see really originate with the Greeks, which will also, of course, have a significant impact much later in our discussion and our history when we begin to talk about the Renaissance. So let's talk about some other key concepts when it comes to the context of the ancient Greeks. Another concept that's really quite important here is the idea of idealism. So idealism really is this concept, this belief, artistically speaking, in creating forms, figures, particularly the human form, that don't necessarily represent a realistic representation of the human body or an individual, but instead represent a perfected ideal. And we see this as something that comes up with certain specific artists, with Greek culture in general. There's the idea of a canon, which we've already seen discussed and utilized within Egyptian art. But the Greeks take that idea, the concept of a canon, to a whole other place. And instead of attempting to use it as a way to create a measure, and here's a standardized set of rules for everyone to use, they use it as a way to try to express perfection in the human figure. And we'll see that with artists, for example, like Polykleitos and his Doryphoros. We could tie this idea back to some philosophical tenets that we see. For example, in places, with the case of Plato, for example. Plato wrote his cave allegory, which talks about this idea of truth and reality. And he believed really that the world of visible forms around us was really just a shadowy reflection of truth, of reality. And that what we see is really just these flickering images. And that real beauty, real goodness existed in a world only of ideas. And so, some artists took this to heart, and we see the attempt to replicate this concept through the expression, mathematical expressions, oftentimes with the human figure that we see, such as with the Doryphoros. So this idea of math, by the way, also brings us to another key concept that we see utilized by the ancient Greeks, and that's the idea of rationalism. So rationalism is kind of an interesting idea. Rationalism really comes down to the importance of the focus on math. The ancient Greeks believed that math was pretty much everything. All things were numbers. And it's amazing when we really begin to look carefully at ancient Greek culture, at architecture and at sculpture, at what an important role math really plays, at how important ratios and harmonics and things that come down to algebraic equations even really are, in the way that they are utilized within these forms. So the Greeks believed that the intellect was the highest human faculty. And that's as part of this concept's belief of rationalism. They also believe that the universe was founded on rational foundations. These principles that, again, all things are numbers and ratios. If you could understand the math, you could understand anything. They believe that through knowledge and through investigation, through research, through study, you could really understand and break down and master the logic of the universe. And these are really heavy, deep philosophical principles that the Greeks took on. And, we see these again brought up once again later during the Renaissance. And these are central concepts that will also come to play when we talk about people like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. So one of our enduring understandings here from the AP framework for this course, Enduring Understanding 2.4, is that the art of ancient Greece and Rome is grounded in civic ideals and polytheism. Etruscan and Roman artists and architects accumulated and creatively adapted Greek objects and forms to create buildings and artworks that appealed to their tastes for eclecticism and historicism. And so this is an important concept. And here we're going to really initially begin talking about the Greeks rather than the Romans, who we'll get to later. But we do see this concept of civic ideals playing an important role. And we often talk about the architecture of democracy, and this is really a concept that comes about later during the neoclassical period. But we do see that many of the roots of these architectural styles have a heavy foundation in some of the political ideals that we see. which have a foundation in ancient Greece. And we'll see that the development of certain Greek forms, for example, the stoa and other architectural forms that we see within the Greek agora, often tie back to this concept pretty closely. We'll also see that, particularly later with the Romans, many of these ideas are continued and added to and modified and changed as they felt the need to do so. But many of the same, the vocabulary, if you will, of architectural forms continues and still continues to this day when we're talking about the architecture that we see in our country, in state capitals and in other official buildings. An additional enduring understanding that we'll be exploring as we talk about these cultures, number 2.5, contextual information for ancient Greek and Roman art can be derived from contemporary literary, political, legal, and economic records, as well as from archaeological excavations conducted in the mid-18th century onward. Etruscan art, by contrast, is illuminated primarily by modern archaeological record and by descriptions of contemporary external observers. So, when we're talking about the Greeks here, we do have quite a bit of literature which is passed down to us, and we've learned a tremendous amount about ancient Greek culture from writers such as Herodotus and others, and Plato, who obviously recorded so much about their culture. And we see quite a bit of literature from this period in time that gives us a very clear idea about Greek culture and about the focus on various aspects of Greek philosophy and life. When we talk about the ancient Romans, in particular here mentioned in our excavations during the 18th century, and we'll talk in greater detail later, of course, about the excavation, the discovery of the ancient cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which we've learned so much about the ancient Romans from these sites. They really represent essentially a frozen microcosm, really, of the Roman world, as these cities were preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Here we're looking at a map of Greece. We can see there the Peloponnesus or Peloponnesian Peninsula. You can see some of the major sites here that we're familiar with. We can also see, if we look carefully, we can see sites such as Sparta there in the south. We can also look a little bit farther to the north and see Delphi and other key sites. And of course, naturally, we can also find Athens and get a clear idea of where these sites are located. Far to the west there, you'll also see Olympia, which of course was the site of the original Olympic Games, a tradition which of course still continues on to this day. Now we'll be talking about, in addition to these sites, which are known as Helladic sites, which occupy really mainland Greece, we'll also be looking, particularly during the Hellenistic, a later period in Greek history, we'll be talking about several sites located on the Ionic coast, which is part of modern-day Turkey. If you were to ask someone really about the center, the heart of ancient Greek culture, and ask them to really identify a specific geography, more than likely Athens is going to be the center that they pick. And within Athens, if we want to narrow that down, it's pretty likely that most people would identify the Acropolis as being the center. And the Acropolis, don't get me wrong, is an incredibly important and central component when we talk about ancient Greek culture and history. And it's certainly one of the most important sites that we study, really, in all of art history. However, there's another part of Athens, which is very, very, very important and often overlooked. And that's the Athenian Agora, the central marketplace here. And so what we're looking at here is basically just a drawing, a plan view, if you will, of the Athenian Agora. And this agora, this marketplace, this central square, is really the heart of the town, where the Acropolis may be the spiritual heart. This is really more of the financial, the bureaucratic center of the city. Here you would have all of the really necessary functions of Athenian government. This is where you would have the senators meet. This is where you would have a theater. This is where you would have the citizens doing their shopping and everything else going on really in the center of the town. And so the Agora, the plan that we're looking at here, dates all the way back to about 600 BC. And some of the other elements and components of it are as recent as 150 CE. So we're looking at an incredibly long period of occupation and usage. On the site today, there's a restored Stoa, which was actually commissioned by the king of Pergamon and then later restored, actually, during the 20th century. But these are really kind of key structures, and this really does represent the center, the heart of Athenian democracy and of Athenian culture in many ways. So the first Greek artworks that we're going to really explore are examples of Greek sculpture, Greek statuary specifically. And we could start our course of study here much earlier and be looking at examples from the Greek geometric period, including small-scale bronzes, the Orientalizing period, etc. But what we're going to be really primarily focusing on here as we begin is the Greek Archaic period. So when we talk about the ancient Greek Archaic period, we're talking about a period in history from about 600 to about 480 BCE. Now, statuary during this period in history has some really kind of interesting characteristics. We tend to see something on archaic statuary called the archaic smile. And we'll talk about this when we look at the examples, but it's really kind of an unusual grin, this almost rictus grin that we see on the faces of statuary from this period in history. And interestingly, it doesn't actually refer to an emotional point of view or a state of mind, but instead it's intended to express that the figure is alive. It's intended to show this concept of existence or life. We also tend to see a lot of elements here that are borrowed from the ancient Egyptians and from the Near East. Included in this, we see very heavily stylized, very geometric hair. We'll also see a very rigid, grid-like format that we see is really quite clearly derived from the Egyptian canon. But the Greeks start with this. However, they don't stick with it for too long. They innovate. And we'll see that the Greek form, the Greek canon, if you will, while it begins with a really quite obvious Egyptian influence, changes quite dramatically and within a relatively short period of time, particularly if we compare it with how long the Egyptian canon maintained its sense of consistency when we're talking about Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom Egyptian. So we're going to be looking here at a great early example of Greek archaic statuary. And the image that we're looking at here obviously is a standing male nude. This type of statuary is what we refer to as a koros. So a koros is a standing male nude figure, as you can see here. They tend to represent these kind of idealized young men. And you can also tell that this has a lot in common with earlier examples in terms of its relationship to the ancient Egyptian canon and style, and even to ancient Assyrian art. Now, these figures, these male koros figures like we see here, are always nude. There are female counterparts, which we'll be talking about, which are called korai, and those are always clothed, which is kind of interesting. So when we look at this one, we can tell a couple of interesting things, though. It's an idealized version. It doesn't necessarily represent a portrait of an actual individual or a real representation of a person, but instead an idealized version of a young man in terms of musculature and form. It's pretty clear, though, that when we look at this, the proportions are not accurate. They're not realistic. When we look at that sharp triangle of the pelvis, we look at the size of the head, the width of the chest compared to the hips, that these are exaggerated and not entirely accurate. We also have a foot stepping forward, you can see here, and a very unrealistic pose. It's very, very rigid. And again, that's something that's taken quite deliberately and quite dramatically from the Egyptian style. Now, if we look carefully here, we can also see a little hint of a grin on his face, which again is typical when we talk about the archaic style. Figures such as this, these koros figures, or kore when we're talking about plural, were often used as grave markers or monuments. But there is still we do have some debate about the function and who these really were intended to identify in some cases. Some of them do actually have inscriptions which remain, and we'll look at an example of one of those here in the near future. Here we can see the same koros, but compared to an Egyptian example. The statue on the right-hand side is Metuhemet from Karnak in ancient Egypt. And this is a very late example of Egyptian statuary. As you can see, we're talking about something here which is from the 24th dynasty. roughly 650 BCE. But look at the similarities in the width of the chest, the rigidity of the arms, how the hands are clasped at the side, and even the step forward. Now there are some clear differences. For example, the Greek version here is nude, and you would not see that in the case of an Egyptian statue. We also have the lack of a back pillar. You can see that the legs are actually carved fully in the round in the Greek version. So even though this does borrow quite heavily from the Egyptian canon, the Greeks have already kind of made it their own at this stage. While we see tremendous similarities in the hair, the proportions, it doesn't have that same sense of permanence and rigidity that we tend to see looking at the Egyptian example. It's still pretty rigid, but you can see that the Greeks here are certainly already breaking away from that Egyptian format. So here we have another example of a koros. And this koros is a later koros dating to about 530 BC. And so you're dealing with a difference here of about 70 years. And while that might, sound like kind of a moderate amount of time, if we think about the ancient Egyptians, 70 years in terms of the developments of art and style would be absolutely nothing. It's a blink of an eye, and it would have zero impact unless we're talking about, maybe, for example, the Amarna period. But looking here at the ancient Greeks, the difference between these two statues is quite astonishing. We'll compare them side by side in a moment. But first, let's just talk a little bit about this particular example, about its context, and a little bit more about it in general. So the example that we're looking at here, we actually know a little bit more about this one. So we know the name of the figure that it represents. His name was Kroisos, and it's from Anavisos in Greece. And it's sometimes referred to as the Anavisos Koros as a result. It's quite large, actually, as well. He's 6 foot 4 inches in height, which is, of course, well above life size, more than likely. But we know that a young man by the name of Kroisos, sometime around 530 BC, was killed in battle. He died a hero's death in battle, apparently. And his grave, which is at Anavisos near Athens, was marked by this statue. And there's an inscription on the base of the work which invites you to stay and mourn at the tomb of dead Kroisos, whom raging Ares destroyed one day as he fought in the foremost ranks. One of the things we can also derive from this one that's kind of interesting is if you look carefully, you can still see some remnants of the original paint, particularly in the hair. These Koros figures would have been brightly painted in many cases, particularly the hair and any other elements. Skin was often left kind of the natural color of the stone. But we certainly would have seen that they would have been embellished. Many of these, we have to think about the original context, the original form of these figures, of these statues, would have been quite different than the way that we encounter them today. All Greek statues really were painted. This was standard. And they used a format, a type of media called encaustic, which is binding up pigment and a hot wax. And while that might sound like a very impermanent method, in fact, encaustic lasts for a very, very long time. It's really quite permanent, which is why we do still see some remaining traces in this statue here. Again, if we look carefully at this work, we can see that it varies a lot from examples we've already seen. We still have the forward step. We still have an unnatural posture in terms of there's no shift of weight, no contrapposto, which we'll be seeing eventually. The rigidity of the arms and the hands, but the proportions here are so much more natural. The pelvis is more natural, the rib cage looks more natural, and the head is even more closely in proportion with the remainder of the body. So here, if we compare the two figures side by side, we can very clearly see the differences. Now, while we still have the same basic posture, the same basic form, the same archaic smile on the face, the same striding forward posture, look at the differences in the anatomy. Look at how much more accurate this example from Anavisos on the right is. Even after 70 short years, the proportions are much more realistic, much more accurate. It's much more natural in terms of the form, the pose. Even though it's still forced and rigid, it looks much more realistic than we see from the example on the left, on the New York Koros. So these two examples show you just how dramatically Greek art is shifting and changing in really what is a fairly rapid and short period of time. So we've had an opportunity to look at some example of Greek male Korai statues. A couple of examples previously here and discussed their appearance. But now we're going to have an opportunity to look at something a little bit different. So this is the female counterpart, really, if you will, and it more than likely served a very different function. So this is known as the peplos kore. And again, koros is male, kore is female. So the koros, the male figures in Greek art, are always nude. Now, the kore figures, on the other hand, are always clothed. Now, there's a lot of debate about these female figures in terms of what they may represent. This one in particular is quite heavily debated. So we know a little bit about this, and we know that it's generally referred to as the peplos kore. There's quite a bit of argument about whether or not she's actually wearing a peplos or another form of garment. A peplos is actually a belted woolen tunic, which was commonly worn by the Greeks. And the peplos actually bears some important context when we're talking about its relationship to Athena, who was given a new peplos during the Panathenaic festival. Her statue, which was a wooden statue of Athena, that was part of this process. But we don't know for certain what this is intended to represent. Now, the reason this statue exists, by the way, the reason it was preserved, so we'll be talking later about the Acropolis and about what happens there in terms of the rebuilding of the Parthenon under Pericles, but basically the site was sacked. It was leveled, really, destroyed by the Persians in 480 BC, which, by the way, marks the end of the Archaic period. And so when that happened, many of these famous and important statues that were really central to Greek culture were knocked down and broken. And they buried them on site, just buried right over these statues. And so excavations on location at the Acropolis have discovered now some of these earlier examples of statuary. Most of what exists on the Parthenon and also on the Acropolis in general today, dates from this later period. It's from the High Classical period, or even in some cases the Early Classical, depending upon which elements we're talking about. But for the most part, what we see there when we're talking about the Acropolis, it's much later. And the original earlier fixtures that were again destroyed largely by the Persians. So examples like this, because they were buried, survived for archaeologists to discover. So there's a lot of debate about this particular figure. We don't know for certain who it represents. It's again called the peplos kore, but it may actually represent a goddess or a priestess. Now, the really important thing here, the missing element, is actually her left hand. If that left hand was still there, we would really probably know what was going on. It could have been holding an offering. It could have been holding a symbol of divinity. For example, if it was Athena, it could have been holding Athena Nike, the goddess of victory, in her hand, which was a common image that we would see. One of the more common thoughts on this one is that this could, in fact, actually represent the goddess of the hunt. And if this does, in fact, represent Diana, then what we would expect to see probably is a bow and arrows, which would have been held in her hands. And also some of the remains of color, which represent the patterning, which are still somewhat remaining on this figure from the encaustic painting, actually kind of support that theory, probably more than any other. But again, there's a lot of debate to this day in terms of who this actually may have represented.